Yeah.
Yeah, welcome everybody. We're very glad to see you all online again. It's been a little while since our geometry summer school, where many of you first joined us. If people want to briefly turn on cameras and say hello, or say hello in the chat, might be nice for our lecturer to know a little bit about where people are joining us from. I recognize a lot of names and faces that are coming from a lot of different time zones. It's nice to see everyone. So we've got North American contingent, and London, and Greece, Costa Rica, France. So yes, we're a very international audience, as you can see. So
that's funny.
Yeah. Okay, let's just. I've got Dubai. Hello, Lisa. Nice to see you. Germany, Surrey, Nottingham. Wonderful. We're just very glad to see everyone here again. It's our geometry summer school, which is this is sort of an extension of happened over a month ago. Where we had a deep dive into the influence of Euclid. And we had invited Dr. Benjamin Wardhaugh to join us for that summer school. And he was unfortunately not able to come. So we decided to extend the summer school well into the autumn. And so here we are now continuing our explorations of the impact and influence of Euclid. We're very pleased to have Dr. Wardhaugh with us. He wrote a book on Euclid, which was very influential as we put together the summer school. It is published under two different titles. There is Encounters with Euclid, How an Ancient Greek Geometry Text Shaped the World. And as you can imagine, as I was preparing for the summer school, I got very excited by that title. And then also this title, The Book of Wonders, The Many Lives of Euclid's Elements. And I was really excited to find this title as well. And I bought both of them. So yeah, pick your favorite cover and get one of those. And Dr. Wardhaugh's a historian and writer, has written many interesting volumes that are looking at the impact of mathematics on our experience of the world today. And we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say about Euclid. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you all for coming. I hope I'm audible. Someone please tell me if I'm not, or if anything goes wrong with the pictures at your end. So, Euclid and his elements, where to start? There's so much to say. It's impossible to talk about Euclid in any fixed finite length of time. It simply doesn't work. For me, Euclid was already a name, I think, in my childhood. I read popular mathematics books, popular science books, and this name came up, the great geometer. And the elements of geometry mentioned in passing, sometimes described, sometimes examples given from them. And it always intrigued me, why does this book live so long? What does a book have to do to last so long? What does a mathematical book in particular have to do to have this lifespan over literally thousands of years? The results are still valid. Okay, that's what mathematics is like, but nevertheless, we don't read other mathematics books of that age so frequently, Euclid's is the one that stands out, and I could never get a handle on why that was. And a little later in my teens, I did mathematics competitions for my sins, and something that comes up there, there's often a Euclidean geometry question, in the sense that Euclidean methods are something of a leveler, but also that not just the results, but also the methods are still important to know about, an important part of what it means to be mathematical, to be a mathematician, to do mathematics. And again, that intrigued me, but at the time I didn't take it further. I became a historian of mathematics and eventually had the opportunity to find out something more about this intriguing book and its very, very long life. And my take on the question about Euclid's longevity and the longevity of the elements of geometry is something like the book lives a long time because there are lots of different ways of reading it, because there are lots of different communities of readers who do different things with it that are meaningful to them, who remake the book even and remake its author in their own image, in conformity with their idea of what mathematics is and what they want to use geometry for. And I came to the idea that Euclid and his elements are almost like a blank mask, a blank facade on which different readers can project many different things according to preference, so that you end up with one book that has, as in my title, many different faces. So that still leaves us with the question of where to start. And I thought I picked this image for the publicity that went with this talk. And I subsequently thought, well, this picture is as good a place to start as anywhere if we want to talk about Euclid and his elements. It's from get this right, it's from a 14th century French manuscript of the elements of geometry in Latin. It's not a picture of Euclid. We can be fairly clear about that one. It's a depiction of the personification of geometry. And she's sitting there, she's drawing diagrams, she's holding instruments, she's speaking to some students. This lovely image occupies the P, the initial P at the beginning of the elements of geometry, P for punctus, point. The first definition of point is that which has no parts. So it's right there at the front of the text. And this has become for me a sort of emblem of several of the things, not all the things, several of the things that geometry can be and can do. So let's focus in on the figure and what she's doing. What is geometry? How do you do it? How does doing it leave you with a text that can be transmitted over hundreds and thousands of years? This picture says it all. The first thing, the most important thing, the best thing you do when you do geometry is you draw diagrams on some kind of surface. This figure, it's not quite clear what surface she's using. The usual speculation is it's a sand tray. She's got a little table and the top is covered with sand and the figures are traced in the sand, but we can't really tell. There are other possibilities. That would link this perhaps right back to an ancient Greek tradition of drawing diagrams literally in the sand. As well as drawing diagrams, you talk about them to an audience of one person, several people, not too many, or they won't be able to see what you're doing. And we don't have a lot of descriptions of geometers at work from the ancient Greek tradition, but the little that we have is consistent with this. One of the best historians of Greek mathematics characterizes Greek mathematical practice as draw a picture and tell a story. And that's clearly what geometry is doing in this depiction. She's drawing a picture and oral instruction is taking place. There's a long tradition of depicting geometers doing comparable things to this, the classic pose where you have a pair of dividers and you're leaning towards some sort of surface in order to create a depiction. So here's one from the Renaissance, and here's a much more modern one, the small version of the statue of Isaac Newton that stands outside the British Library in London, and a nice touch that even Newton is depicted in this classic geometrical pose with the classic geometrical instrument, the pair of dividers. So there's a really long visual tradition, almost iconographic tradition, that this is what the geometer does. You can tell they're a geometer because of the pair of dividers and the pose leaning towards the surface to draw the diagram. How does this generate text? How does this give us a book? How does it give us an elements of geometry? Well, you can draw your diagrams on more durable surfaces. In the Greek world, that meant papyrus, subsequently parchment, paper. This is what a geometrical diagram looks like when it's on papyrus, when it's on parchment. This is from a Byzantine Greek copy of Euclid's Elements, and more detail is possible. It can be smaller, it can be portable, and it can be tremendously durable. So it can speak to not just your live audience of students and scholars, but a long, long history of future generations, potentially. But the form of the diagrams seems to be another feature of this tradition that is very, very constant over a long period of time. The circles, the lines, the letter labels. The letter labels are there so that you can refer to the diagram, to the points on the diagram in a text. And again, here's what the text looks like on parchment in Byzantine Greece. So what we have here, this story begins with a dynamic performance in front of an audience, literally a performance, something whose essence is to be live. But what it generates is two different static traces of itself. First, the diagram that you build up manually, straight edge dividers, whatever your writing implement is. And second, the text, which is in some sense the substitute for the live version of your teaching, for what you would have said live. Differences in what you say and how you say it certainly come in when it becomes text. But it's interesting how the diagrams and the texts almost run in parallel. If you ask which of them do I study first, there's no straightforward answer. They kind of bounce off each other. And that's another very long-lived feature of the Euclidean geometrical tradition, this almost symbiosis between diagram and text. And this pair of traces of the original geometrical performance can then be used. You can study them in private. You can use them as a help to working up your own geometrical performance. You can copy the diagram in the margins. You can work through the text. You can even speak through the text. As a learner, there are various ways you can use this sort of material. And so geometry in this sense becomes assimilated to literature. It becomes a special kind of literature with a special prose style. It's quite repetitive. It's quite almost hypnotic. It has quite a small vocabulary of fixed phrases. It's very, very impersonal, blank, austere. Let a circle have been drawn. Let a triangle have been drawn. There's no first person in Euclid. There's no direct address to the reader, no second person. There are no fun examples of the kind that we find in other mathematical traditions and other kinds of mathematical textbooks. There's none of the kind of, imagine a merchant going down from Athens to, there's none of that. It's really, I'm going to come back to my image of the blank mask. There's an awful lot of things it doesn't do, that it doesn't tell you about the author, about itself, about its situation. And you could see that as a weakness, but as I've said, I think that's one of this book's strengths and part of its ability to be read in so many ways by so many different people. But it does mean that the biographical information about Euclid, which I would like to have as a historian, is very, very meager. Once it's a text, it can be transmitted through the routes that texts are transmitted. I've already mentioned Byzantine Greece, which is where this celebrated copy of the Elements was made in the 9th century. The oldest complete manuscript of the Elements that we happen to have is that one pictured there. It's translated into Arabic, into Latin, and in Latin, finally, it's printed, first printed in 1482, at quite an early stage in the story of European printing. And at this point, the diagrams become a problem because they're expensive and complicated to get onto the page. They require special techniques. But those problems are solved, and there's a tremendous tradition of Euclid's Elements translated, printed, translated, re-edited, retranslated in many European languages over the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries in particular. So just as one example, there's a French version from the 17th century. There are versions in many of the major European languages during those centuries. This is a trajectory that is very similar to that of other Greek texts. And people who study Euclid's Elements in this sort of form, in print or even in beautiful manuscripts, are able to think of it as Greek literature. And you start to find these quotations in which Euclid is a Greek author, Euclid is the key to the Greek mind, these kinds of things, in which he's simply a representative of a Greek tradition rather generally. But Euclid is not just literature. So let's focus on a slightly different part of this picture. Geometry herself, not so much what she's doing as who she is and how she comes to be depicted in the first place. There's a long medieval tradition of depictions of the 7 liberal arts, of whom one is geometry. There's one of the many examples that I've put up there. They all have their own accoutrements. You can recognize geometry by, again, a nice big pair of dividers. There she's got a long staff as well, possibly it's a measuring rod, or possibly it's a straight edge for drawing. She also is accompanied by a surveying instrument on the floor beside her, which we will come back to. If the liberal arts are personified, they're nearly always personified as female because the word for art is feminine in Latin. This starts to create a sense that geometry is something you can fall in love with. Geometry is something you can get really passionate about. You can not just like geometry, but really almost have an emotionally loaded relationship with geometry. And both geometry and Euclid in this tradition are spoken of as teachers, inspirations, sources of wisdom. And indeed, there's a long tradition. There's another nice depiction there. There's a long tradition of thinking of Euclid himself not as a geometer, but as a philosopher. So here, for example, in the title page of the first English version of Euclid's Elements, London, 1570, Elements of Geometry, the most philosopher Euclid. By this point, that's almost a commonplace. Many of the printed editions of the Elements have had descriptions like this, in which Euclid is a philosopher. And that's not a metaphor. It doesn't mean something other than what it appears to mean. He's literally thought to have been a member of Plato's circle in Athens. He's identified incorrectly, as it turns out, with another Euclid, Euclid of Megara, who was a philosopher, and about whom there are some anecdotes and some texts concerning his relationship with Platonic philosophy. So Euclid has been, by this confusion of identities, Euclid has been identified completely as a philosopher, and he's, so to speak, written into scenes like this one. This is a Roman mosaic of a philosophy school. Euclid is really seen, imagined in situations like this. There's a truth to this, because Euclid's Elements and geometry more generally had long been used as a way of training the mind. Plato himself says that studying geometry, studying geometrical things, is a way to shift your focus away from the phenomenal world and to shift your focus towards that which never changes, eternal, unchanging geometrical truths. It's a propedeutic. It leads you into the contemplation of higher philosophical truths. To that end, we know that geometry was studied in the Platonic school in later centuries, and one of the first Greek commentaries we have on Euclid's Elements is from the Platonic philosopher Proclus. And his commentary is very much geared towards the use of the text by philosophy students. It's almost as though Euclid's Elements has become the math requirement on a philosophy course, and start to wonder what some of these trainee philosophers really thought about the mathematics, the geometry that they were being obliged to assimilate. It's in this context that the story grows up that over the door of Plato's academy, there was an inscription to the effect that no one ungeometrical may enter. Doubtful historically, but it tells us a lot about how geometry had come to be seen by, let's say, the 4th or 5th century AD. The tradition continues of using geometrical methods in philosophy. The page I put up there is from the 17th century philosopher Spinoza, who borrows in a rather different way from the geometrical tradition. He takes, so to speak, the rhetoric of geometry, if that's a legitimate way of putting it. He takes the axioms, definitions, propositions, and proofs. He uses that framework, which he's learned from geometrical texts from Euclid, and uses it as a way to present his philosophical material, his celebrated ethics. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last, to use geometry as a substitute for logic in that sense. Geometrical methods as a different and better way of arranging material on the page, arranging material so as to be really persuasive. As I say, borrowing the rhetorical trappings of geometry. Furthermore, Euclid in the European tradition comes to be thought of as a specimen of European wisdom, if you like, and is taken around the world. In the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries took Latin copies of Euclid's Elements to China, arranged their translation into Chinese. The diagram there is recognizably the same as the one we saw on the French title page a few moments ago. That tradition continued too. In the 19th century, we find British enthusiasts for Euclid translating the text into Indian languages such as Urdu, for the purpose of providing training in what they believed was a universally valid set of methods. Another way of reading this lovely picture. What's that in her left hand? It's we think of Euclidean geometry being done with a pair of dividers or compasses and a straight edge unmarked ruler. But that's not what she's got. She's got a set square, which is an instrument much more strongly associated with practical mathematics, with trades like carpentry, as in this another medieval picture depiction of the ideal carpenter at work. So there's a sense in which this picture is reminding us that geometry is not just something you learn for its own sake or because it's good literature, not just something you study for philosophical purposes, but also something that has outcomes in practical life, that has real uses in all sorts of areas in the practical world. The figures that geometry is drawing recall some of those that we find in surveying texts from the centuries before this copy of the Elements was made. There's a sort of tradition of rather blocky geometrical diagrams and illustrations. And you can see there that the circle in particular, it's not in a sense a geometrical circle, which would have by definition no breadth. It's colored in, it's green, it has a little width, it's like a ring, similarly to the pictures that personify geometry is drawing over there on the left. For many centuries in Europe, Euclid's Elements as such was not available complete. What was available were extracts from the text, which were presented alongside manuals of surveying, particularly. They provide the definitions, the basic geometrical material, but you then move on to how to survey a field, how to work out its area, how to work out distances in sites on the ground. This practical tradition, again, had both a long prehistory and a long later history. One of the possible sources for Euclid's ideas, and perhaps even for some of his terminology, was the practical mathematics tradition in both Greece and elsewhere in the Near East. Euclid, as far as we know, worked in Alexandria, not in Athens. It's not in the heart of the Greek world, but in North Africa. There's the possibility of contact with Egyptian methods of surveying fields, working out distances and areas by practical means for practical reasons. The long European tradition of reading Euclid, again, frequently sees him as a practical man. Here's another medieval depiction by the scribe Matthew Paris, in which Euclid, he's named there on the left, is depicted as an astronomer or possibly astrologer. He's sighting at a star along a staff. He's holding in his left hand something that's possibly an possibly an armillary sphere of some kind. He's being handed an astrolabe by the other figure on the right there. So again, parallel to the tradition in which Euclid is called a philosopher, and parallel to the tradition in which he's called an author, there's a tradition in which Euclid is called an astronomer, a surveyor, a hero of practical life. This was by no means just a European matter. Euclid's Elements, as I mentioned, went through Byzantium and the Islamic world, and we find medieval discussions that draw on Euclidean ideas in the context of, for instance, making mosaics, tessellations, creating decorations of this kind. The example that I put up here, finding new ways to divide space into particular numbers of shapes or into particular subgroupings of those shapes. We have texts in which the tradition of Islamic design is brought into contact with Euclidean methods explicitly. In the European Renaissance, again, Euclidean methods are brought consciously into contact with practical concerns, for instance, in the development of perspective. That's, I suppose, illustrated twice in this picture because perspective has been used, albeit imperfectly, to make this drawing, but it's also a drawing of a Euclidean shape, one of the Platonic solids that Euclid describes towards the very end of his book. A final way in which Euclidean methods impact on practical life, of course, is through the scientific revolution. In the 17th century, Newton, when he comes to present his ideas about celestial mechanics, how the planets move, chooses, as Spinoza had chosen for his philosophy, chooses the language of Euclidean geometry, definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs. He also chooses in more detail a clearly geometrical method of presentation in which there's a labeled diagram, very similar to the diagrams you would find in a copy of Euclid's Elements in this period, and a text that refers constantly to that diagram that works in symbiosis with it. And there's an irony about this because, of course, what Newton was doing in a sense was not just breaking existing ideas about space and physics, but existing ideas about mathematical proof, what was valid and what was not valid. But nevertheless, he evidently judged it important at a rhetorical level to present his ideas in Euclidean clothing. A final set of responses to Euclid and his Elements. What is this figure doing? I've not counted how many of them are. There are about 8 of those little figures on the left. They all seem to be quite attentive. They're looking towards geometry or towards the diagram. They're doing what you want your students to do. They're paying attention, except for this one. There are several possible ways of reading this, but I have the awful feeling that he's stifling a yawn. Oh dear. Not everybody who has read Euclid or engaged with Euclid has been wholly impressed or has responded wholly positively in these optimistic ways that I've evoked over the last half hour. Some have felt a bit negative about Euclid. I used the word hypnotic earlier on. I said that the text is very repetitious. The theorems and the proofs and the propositions and the proofs just kind of keep coming, and there are hundreds of them. And I think it is legitimate, perhaps, to find that not hypnotic, but boring, maybe. Another way to slice that is to say that too much study of this material will not elevate your mind, but damage it. And particularly in the 19th century, we start to find a tradition of writing in which mathematics is dangerous to the human mind. People publish first-hand accounts of excessive mathematical training inducing a nervous breakdown. Several people who dropped out of the English universities published testimonies of that kind. I put up here a different example, Mary Fairfax, later Mary Somerville, under which name she became well known as a scientific author. Very well known for her mathematics, for her remarkable mathematical mind. There is a lovely story in which, in her youth, like many another bright mathematical youth, she wished to study Euclid's Elements, got her hands on a copy, and her family, when they found out about this, were outraged. They were seriously alarmed. They took the book away because they seriously believed that too much study of Euclid would send her mad. We could multiply examples of this idea that Euclidean geometry was not a liberation to the mind, but a straitjacket into which you don't want to put your mind if you can avoid it. And indeed, eventually Euclid's Elements was dropped, or the repetitious rote study of Euclid's Elements was dropped in the English universities and the English schools that fed them. That happened around 1900. On the whole, it has happened earlier elsewhere. France, for instance, had moved away from Euclidean methods in teaching about a century earlier. There were other reasons for skepticism about Euclid. One of them was to do with fuller study of the manuscript tradition. Early in the 19th century, this manuscript turned up in the Vatican archives. It's a Greek Byzantine copy of Euclid's Elements. Diagram on this page accompanies Pythagoras' theorem. It's clearly recognizable as the same text, except it's not exactly the same text. And this raised a great deal of doubt about how authentic the text of Euclid's Elements was, how far we might have been misled by an exclusive reliance on the Greek tradition rather than attending to what Arabic and Latin translations of the text had to say, how much might have been lost in transmission over the many centuries of the element's history. Discoveries of papyri, discoveries of fragments of the text scratched on potsherds like this one, pointed in a similar direction, that maybe the Elements was not a single monolithic text, but a family of texts with a good deal of internal variation to which we need to be alive. And this would be too much to say it led to a crisis, but again, it weakens faith in the Euclidean text as such, as the be-all and end-all of geometrical learning. In the 20th century, it's been seriously suggested that Euclid never existed, that it was the name of a team of mathematicians, that the text simply accreted over several generations, and Euclid was merely its editor, the person who put the final seal on the final version of the text, if indeed he existed at all. Some of these suggestions are almost beyond proof and disproof because of how very little biographical information we have about Euclid. Yet another set of reasons for skepticism about Euclid are to do with, well, is Euclid's Elements really a true description of physical space? William Blake is a lovely emblem for this kind of thing, the idea that the figure with the pair of dividers is not revealing the true nature of things, but imposing laws on the world that the world might be better off without. Concurrently, or a little later, mathematicians were getting clever with their descriptions of space. Non-Euclidean geometries start to be devised, and what then happens in the 20th century? Well, Einstein happens, the idea that the real nature of space is that it's curved. In other words, that Euclid's Elements is not, after all, a true description of physical space, a true description of the universe, but that in fact the non-Euclidean alternatives are the truth. And this is another reason, another tradition in which skepticism about Euclid and his Elements get going. Rather ironically, there's a spacecraft about to be launched. In fact, it might have gone up by now, with the specific intention of finding out about the large-scale structure of space by doing very deep space observations to map the geometry of the distant universe. And the spacecraft, ironically, has been named Euclid. I like that touch. So Euclid and his Elements also fall from grace, but not entirely. They never entirely go away, and I suspect they never will. They can be found in all sorts of unexpected places. That dress, for instance, is from one of the collections of Schiaparelli, the Zodiac Collection. According to an interview given by her publicist, the shapes in these designs were specifically inspired by Euclid's geometry. I've never been able to find out anything more detailed than that about the route from Euclid to these designs, but the connection was certainly made at the time. The text itself has been treated almost as an art object, and recently a coloured publication was made in which the diagrams are, which in a sense the dynamic quality of the diagrams is put back in by the use of different colours to show the stages of their construction, the relationships between the different parts of the diagrams. It's a completion of a project that was started in the 19th century. It's a beautiful object, and it shows one of the ways in which Euclidean ideas can be repurposed as art, almost. Or more directly, we find geometrical and Euclidean ideas actually directly used to create artworks. Many examples could be given. I've put there one of my personal favourites. So I hope I've made a credible case that this is a book with more than one face, and I hope I've argued successfully that one of the reasons for the longevity of this book is the fact that so many different traditions of readers, so many different communities of readers have found different ways to project their own concerns onto Euclid and onto Euclid's book, different ways to take this text and do things with it that were meaningful to them. As I say, one of the reasons that's possible is because the book itself is so blank, says so little about Euclid himself, says so little about its time and place, really. It functions so much like a blank facade onto which many different readers can project their different concerns. Thank you.